Buongiorno a tutti, io mi chiamo Fabio Turone, sono un giornalista scientifico. Oggi siamo qui per fare due chiacchiere sul tema dell'incertezza, della statistica e della complessità di comprendere il significato fino in fondo di che cosa viene prodotto dalla ricerca scientifica con Regina Nuzzo, che è una collega giornalista scientifica americana che insegna statistica all'Università Gallaudet di Washington per non udenti. Lei stessa ha difficoltà di udito e appunto si è occupata anche come giornalista scientifico di scrivere, ha scritto per esempio per la rivista Nature degli articoli sugli errori più comuni da parte degli scienziati nell'uso della statistica. Negli ultimi anni è anche diventata consulente per la comunicazione della American Statistical Association e si è occupata proprio di questioni anche legate all'incertezza e alla comunicazione dell'incertezza. Good morning, Regina. Nice to see you.
Good morning. Good to be here. Thank you, Fabio.
I would like to start from your experience of not only a teacher, but a communicator around uncertainty and the work you have been doing with the American Statistical Association. Can you tell us something about that?
My work with the American Statistical Association really works with the things I've been doing as a science journalist, which is to help make this idea of uncertainty understandable, relevant, appropriate to all kinds of audiences. And in particular, the general public, scientists, science journalists have a hard time with uncertainty. What does this even mean? Our brains don't like uncertainty. So my work with the American Statistical Association is specifically to help journalists and the public understand what it means when we talk about scientific evidence or statistical evidence or statistical confidence, and to help put that in perspective for people in a way they can use.
So we start to go into the matter, and one of the typical problems that as a journalist, as a science journalist, I have is to try to convey the idea that a statistically significant result is the best approach we can look for, is the best evidence we can base our reasoning on, but still it is not always close to the idea of scientific truth, which is very often what people look for. Even politicians ask for scientific truths. How do you explain the difference between significance and evidence or a fact?
That is a terrific question. How are we explaining to people and making this understandable the difference between scientific truth, scientific evidence, statistical evidence? And the problem sometimes is in our language and our expectations for what science can actually do. Science is this messy process of turning facts into knowledge. So we accumulate facts and we accumulate evidence, but then translating that into knowledge or decisions, actions, things we need to do, that's a societal problem. When we're deciding that there is enough evidence for us to take action, that's something different than saying this is true. I have scientist friends who say to me, why are statisticians so difficult? Why can't they just tell us the answer? And I say, what is the answer? We don't know the answer. The universe never tells us the answer. What we do as humans is accumulate evidence, and that evidence is often messy and uncertain, but through the scientific process, we can continue to accumulate it until we feel comfortable with something. But it's important, I think, for everyone to recognize that when we set a threshold for evidence, that dichotomy, that yes or no, that bright line is artificial. It's a necessary evil that we need because we need to take action on something. We can't wait forever until we have 100% certainty, and that never really exists either. So I say statistical evidence and statistical certainty is about society and humans making decision. It's about behavior, not about the truth.
Well, you mentioned the threshold. And of course, the idea is that it is considered by convention that some results can be accepted. And so they are worth to be published and communicated. Then, of course, the threshold is very different depending on the discipline. So when it comes to particle physics, we want much stronger evidence before we can declare that we saw a specific subatomic event that we may be looking for many years. And at the same time, we also know that we can repeat that kind of experiment a number of times that allows us, in principle, to reach that level of statistical strength. In other areas, the convention is based on, for instance, concerning COVID, sometimes you need to decide what you're going to do. And so you decide that you cannot wait and you choose maybe the least unlikely or the least dangerous way. So is this idea still in your experience? You have been dealing with a lot of scientists in the United States and abroad from different disciplines. Do you think that scientists know enough about the conventional nature of these thresholds, or maybe still they need to adapt, even the scientists themselves?
You're talking about really interesting things. You're talking about setting this threshold that's different for different disciplines. And that's absolutely the way that it should be. You mentioned particle physics. So the threshold for evidence there is 1 in 3.5 million. The typical threshold for evidence in, say, a study in psychology is 1 in 20. Talking about some sort of level of uncertainty. So the cost of collecting data is one of the things that we should be considering. And I think that sometimes that does affect what's going on. But there are other things behind setting that threshold that we don't always take into consideration. And you touched on one of them, and that's the cost. The cost of overlooking something true in real, and also the cost of declaring something to be true in real and taking action on it and having it be wrong. So your example of COVID-19 treatment is perfect. So we can't wait for 100% certainty. We won't happen. We won't have that. That will never happen. So what do? If we hold out for too high of a level of confidence in this treatment working, then how many lives are we losing because of this inaction? So that's the cost of overlooking and not taking action on something that's true. On the other hand, if we're too hasty and we move too quickly on something that's not actually true, then we're losing lives because of that. This should be an explicit calculation, this idea of the cost of false positives and false negatives. Does it always explicitly enter into scientists' calculations? Unfortunately, no. Also, does the general public and do journalists understand this and give it the attention and the respect it deserves? No, unfortunately not either. But there are other things that we should be considering in setting that threshold. And here's just one example to add to the two examples that you have here. If we're talking about something like ESP, for example, there was an octopus in Germany a few years ago that managed to correctly predict 8 out of 8 World Cup matches that Germany was involved in. That is highly statistically significant. Should we be using the same threshold for that as for declaring a new relaxation technique to be effective? Should we? No, right? We should not. And that's because we're talking about something that has low plausibility. So we need to take into consideration that plausibility of what we're talking about here. And that is also something that is often not at all included in calculations explicitly or implicitly, and it's not often recognized by journalists or the public either.
Yeah, so the famous quote from Carl Sagan comes to mind, which extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I think that what you are saying is that also the inverse truth must be taken into account. So there are some questions or some contexts in which factors that are outside the pure statistics may suggest to accept a lower threshold because of what's at stake in general. And I think that what you're saying is that not only we need to know more about the statistics, but we also need to learn much more about how the different statistical methods and the different statistical thresholds should be applied to give the best possible indication for practice, which is basically the issue at stake in my perception as a journalist. So whenever the general audience has to deal with statistics, with numbers coming from statistics, it's because they have to choose between maybe a risk and a benefit, or a harm and a cost, and that kind of choices. And sometimes it's the policymaker that has to mandate behaviors. So maybe you can further elaborate. Is it what you're saying?
Absolutely. I think you're bringing up a great point. And I especially like how you're talking about competing risks. When we need to make a decision or take action, even not taking action is making a decision. Nothing in life is foolproof. The universe doesn't give us any guarantees. So no matter what, we're taking a risk on things. And I think it's important to bring this either back into the policymakers or, when possible, educate the general public so they can make an informed decision for themselves. And I'll just give you an example that's a lot of debate here in the United States. I'm not sure if it is in Italy, and that has to do with mammography screening for breast cancer, mammograms. If you go online and look about routine screening, meaning you don't have any symptoms, you're just screening every year routinely, you often see things saying 21% reduced chances of dying if you get your breast cancer screening every year. And that's as far as they say. So if you just look at that, who wouldn't want to reduce their chances of dying of breast cancer. It's highly statistically significant. They have a good reason for saying that. But what they're not doing is talking about the full context of what's going on there. And I think that it sounds very different to say 21% reduced risk in dying. That's different than if I were to say out of 1,000 women who are not screened for breast cancer, 5 would die over a 15-year period, versus out of 1,000 women who are screened, 4 would die. That's giving you sufficient information to say, okay, is it worth it to me to go through the cost or the pain or whatever you want to be among that 1 out of 1,000 that might be saved? For some people, it is. For some people, it isn't. Let me just give you another example. And this one also having to do with this idea of statistical significance versus practical significance. We often see studies telling us we need to exercise more, and we need to exercise more so that we don't gain weight as we get older. And there are these studies. There was one a few years ago, 34,000 women they followed over a 13-year period. And the results, they said, were highly statistically significant, that you need to vigorously exercise at least 1 hour a day, 7 days a week, in order to not gain weight. Highly statistically significant. So the journalists, of course, jump on this and say people are lazy and they need to exercise more. If you dig down and actually look at the effect, the size of the effect, you as a journalist, you would know to look for this. Not a lot of people do. It ended up being 0.05 kilogram difference per year between the people who were out there running an hour a day versus those who didn't do much or took, a walk a few times a week. This is not much of a difference. And I feel like if we gave people that information as journalists or whatever, then I, the public, can make a decision. Maybe it's worth it to me because I love to exercise. Maybe I'll just do with a few, less junk food and sundaes and ice cream in exchange. So in both of these cases, it's not about statistical significance. Both of those were highly statistically significant. What we're doing is talking about that competing risk and the size. So what you're saying about bringing in all the other information besides statistics is exactly spot on. You need statistics. I'm not saying get rid of that, but it needs to be within the context of the field, that should be starting the discussion, not just stopping with statistical significance. We're done. That's it.
Something that I loved, and I'm always grateful for your work, was that there is also another issue, a big issue that currently needs also to be considered, which is what we said until now is the interpretation that we need to use for ideal statistics, for ideally collected data. But then we also know, and the American Statistical Association also discussed this a lot, that still there is a lot of researchers, there is a lot of published literature that has been using statistical tools in a way that is far from ideal. So what would you like to tell us about this? How do you approach this topic, which is quite complicated to approach, I think?
So far, you and I have been talking, or I've been talking mostly about how we're helping journalists and the general public understand these statistical tools. But you're right. That's assuming that they have been applied completely correctly. And behind the scenes, it's become increasingly apparent over the past 10 years or so that scientists don't necessarily understand it themselves. And sometimes they're abusing it. So they're misusing statistics, they're misunderstanding statistics. In some cases, they're abusing it. So I'm not saying that scientists are committing fraud. There is a reward system in science to find things, to publish statistically significant things. And that sort of incentive means that it's very easy for us humans to fool ourselves during this data analysis process. So you and I have been talking about statistical significance. There is a deep literature and research underneath that, and how it can be very unconsciously misused. That is, it's very easy to find something that's statistically significant that is not really. And one of, I think, the most unfortunate or ironic things is that in journalism especially, and even in science publishing, it's very exciting to publish sexy, interesting, novel, surprising findings. Those are the things that make it into the top journals and make it onto the front page of newspapers. But it's those things that are statistically significant and surprising that are most likely to be wrong. And this is really unfortunate. And this leads to the kind of whiplash science. I call it whiplash because one day coffee is good for you. You see one study saying coffee is good for you. The next week, you see another study saying coffee is not good for you. How do you reconcile all of these things? In some cases, scientists are actually just misinterpreting, honestly, even good faith science, misinterpreting the results and the statistical tools to get us to that conclusion.
So to go back to the uncertainty, basically we need to start realizing that there is a statistical measure of uncertainty, but maybe we need to take into account a kind of a bigger uncertainty around how much we can trust any scientific result, right? So there are several measures of uncertainty measured by statisticians and measured by scientists, but then how can we, I mean, are there proxies for how would you evaluate the margins of certainty around a scientific result?
So I'd like to talk a little bit about what it means when we're talking about uncertainty and statistical significance. So far in our conversation, we've been dancing around that, and we haven't really talked about what these things actually mean. So our typical threshold for statistical significance, let me back up. The way that we're determining statistical significance, what we've been talking about, is really just what I call an index of surprise. It means if there was nothing going on, if there's no effect, if the octopus that we claim to have ESP does not have ESP, and it's just random guessing, how surprised should we be by the findings that we just observed? And that's all it is. It's just saying how surprising are these things? And that should lead you then to go on and do a replication study, to gather more evidence, to look at the biological plausibility, to look at everything around that, and not just stop with this idea that it's surprising. We take statistically significant, that word significant, And we tend to think that means it's important or real or big or weighty, when really it just means signifying something, meaning it has a little sign, a road sign saying, hey, take a second look at this. That's all that means. Statisticians also use this idea of, sometimes you hear them talk about confidence, like a confidence interval. This is also important, but the word confidence, I think, can be a little misleading, because it doesn't mean, if we say that something has 95% confidence, that doesn't mean that there's a 95% chance that this is real. The uncertainty is important because it lets us accumulate then the evidence over time. So when I look at a study, I will look at the uncertainty, I will look at the effect size, and then I look up other studies that talk about the same sort of thing. If there are any replications, if there are studies done in other populations or other information around it. And I try to put that into perspective. There's one example that I think that was very useful. The New York Times a few years ago reported on a vaccine for Ebola, the Ebola virus. And the headline and the lead, the top bit of information said that the vaccine was 100% effective. That implies that it is working absolutely, that there is no uncertainty, that this is perfect. If you go to the study, you see that this confidence interval that I'm talking about, this net, this cloud of uncertainty, actually was between 70% and 100%. That's a big difference. And when the New York Times journalist was called out on this, he said, but this is what the journal reported, this is what the scientists reported, and he ignored that uncertainty because he felt like the uncertainty wasn't important. In this case, I feel like the scientists should have emphasized this, and it would have been good if the journalist had interpreted this for us, to say that no vaccine is 100% effective, 100% perfect, but that the current evidence suggests it's at least 70% effective. And that in context, 70% effective is all we needed to stop another Ebola outbreak. So this is acknowledging that there's uncertainty. It's not 100%. We're not sure exactly what it is. We're pretty sure that it's at least 70%, but that's okay. 70% is good enough. We don't need it to be 100% effective. To me, that's the full picture. And that's something that's more nuanced and subtle and informative than just giving one number and ignoring the uncertainty and saying it's not important or that it detracts somehow from the scientists' work. It's uncertainty is not a bad thing. That margin of error, that bit, it's necessary. This comes with the universe and it's part of doing science. It's not a problem or a personal failing or a moral failing that we need to hide or cover.
And if I remember correctly, the journal you mentioned was the Lancet.
Lancet, you have a very good memory,
which has an excellent track record in putting medical research in context and in explaining the right interpretation for the practice. So it was a real unusually significant example of the mistakes we can all fall into. And I would like to just ask you to conclude, because we are going beyond the time allotted, with a question. Do you think that this kind of contextualized, highly complex interpretation will become the norm, or are we having to face this kind of oversimplification for ages?
Right now, when people are looking at how science is changing with respect to statistical evidence and statistical tools, there are some people, some studies who are saying nothing has changed, and they're very pessimistic, and they say nothing will change. On the other hand, there are studies who are saying this is all having an effect, that the conversations are changing things, journals are changing. I fall a little somewhere in the middle, but close to the optimistic side. I think that the real change is coming from young people, young scientists, who I think more intuitively understand that the world is not binary. It's not dichotomous. It's not black or white, that in everything it's shades of gray and shades of uncertainty. And I feel like young people culturally are learning to embrace that in general. Plus, they're being exposed to these things early in their education statistically. And old people, they're going to do what they do. Young people, that's where the hope for the future is. And I feel like they're the ones that are doing the innovating and the leading in all of this. So I'm optimistic, maybe not for the near future, but for the eventual future.
Well, and I'm glad that in your view, the more you talk about the limits of science, the better the science becomes in the future, essentially. So instead of being worrying for the for painting a weaker science, we are helping science become stronger and stronger. So, well, thank you very much, Regina Nuzzo. It was a pleasure discussing with you. And I will now salute everyone and vi auguro di proseguire col programma del CICAP Fest di quest'anno. Buonasera a tutti.
Thank you, Fabio.